Yes, good morning everyone. So this morning I'm going to talk about a group of Quaker women who were opposed to the First World War. Indeed, they were opposed to war in all its forms. The opposition for most of them, certainly the women I'm going to talk about today, had its roots in their religious beliefs and in the long-standing pacifist traditions of the Society of Friends, as Quakers are also known. And theirs was a pacifism and a faith that manifested itself in action. So it wasn't enough just to object to the war. They felt a responsibility to act and to intervene directly to alleviate some of the consequences of the conflict for civilian non-combatants and women and children in particular. My talk draws on research that I've been doing on and off now for 4 or 5 years into a group of local Quaker women who are based in Birmingham and the surrounding area. But as time is short this morning, I'm going to focus on probably 3 or 4 individuals, just to try and give you a flavour, I think, of the type of activism that they were involved in terms of peace and humanitarian aid in this period. And before I start, I'll just say a very brief word about Quakers, just in case there's someone in the room who's not that familiar with them. Quakers are a religious group that emerged out of the religious upheavals of the 17th century and the Civil War. And for our purposes today, and this is a huge oversimplification of their beliefs, so apologies for that, but for our purposes today, what's important is that they have a fundamental belief that there is something of God in everyone. And it's that principle that lies at the heart of their campaigns, not only for peace and on behalf of refugees and so forth, but also in causes like prison reform, working class education, and other causes in which they've been involved over the centuries. So in terms of the Birmingham context, by the dawn of the First World War, Birmingham and the surrounding area was home to a numerically small but disproportionately influential Quaker community. So by this period, families like Cadbury, Albright, Southall, Barrow, Sturge occupied a leading role in the manufacturing and the political civic elite of the town, as it was later city. And similarly, the women of these families are extremely influential in women's movements in the city and also in civic activism. So if we look at things like the Birmingham Women's Suffrage Society, the Birmingham Women's Settlement, campaigns for temperance, educational initiatives, and the health and welfare reforms aimed at women and children, then you'll find the women of these families occupy a leading role in the organisations who campaigned for that sort of thing. The women I'm looking at are predominantly middle class, and some are wealthier than others, but on the whole, they're predominantly middle class. They're also, for their time, as women, they're very well educated. Quaker women are not precisely equal with Quaker men. You hear that said sometimes, and they're not, but they're sort of comparatively more equal than most when you compare them to other religious groups. And they're brought up in a tradition where it's legitimate for them to assume leadership roles in certain contexts. And obviously that's reinforced by their class as well. So they're relatively privileged, but they're very aware that they're privileged. And that plays into some of their reasoning for the campaigns they'll be doing. Now, As we'll be marking the centenary of the International Women's Peace Congress at The Hague later on this month, I thought I'd start with that event and some of the Birmingham women who supported the International Congress and indeed who wanted to attend. Peace campaigns in Birmingham had started before the war, and Geraldine Cadbury, for example, who you see here, had actually been part of a peace delegation to Germany with her husband Barrow in the weeks leading up to the declaration of war in 1914. And she was also one of the supporters of the Hague Congress. She is one of the 156 women who were listed as part of the British Committee for the International Congress. I suppose I should say at this point, although I suspect most of you will know this, the context of the Congress, it was very controversial. The war had divided women's suffrage campaigners. So Emmeline Pankhurst and the Women's Social and Political Union were supportive of the war. The National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, which is where most of these women would sit in terms of their support for suffrage, was divided. Millicent Fawcett supports the war, but there is a pacifist group that splits away because of her support for the war. And it's these women who are responsible for sort of organising the British end of the International Congress at The Hague. So, as I say, Geraldine is listed among the 156 women members of the British Committee of the International Congress, alongside other Birmingham women, Quakers. So Katherine Albright is also a member. She was formerly the warden of Birmingham Women's Settlement. Sophia Sturge, who is the woman who initiates Quaker campaigns on behalf of German and Austrian enemy aliens in the UK. Mary Snowdon Braithwaite, who was the American-born warden of Woodbrook College, just up the road, and her sister-in-law, Ethel C. Wilson, who also lived at Woodbrook during the time, and they're all listed as members of that group. And a number of them did want to attend the Hague Congress. As I say, it was very controversial. They were pilloried in the press, and very few of the British women were actually allowed to attend. They didn't actually make it. Geraldine wanted to attend, along with her daughter Dorothy. Florence Barrow, of whom more shortly, wanted to attend, and Florence's sister-in-law, Ethel Barrow, was also keen to go to The Hague. Unfortunately, none of them were allowed passports to go, so they didn't actually make it. Ethel's husband, Harrison Barrow, was actually imprisoned himself for 6 months for publishing a pamphlet entitled A Challenge to Militarism, which you can actually see in the exhibition at BMAG at the moment, I think. He published this pamphlet in support of conscientious objectors without submitting it to the censor, and got 6 months in Pentonville for that reason. The interesting point about Birmingham women and the Hague Congress is that Elizabeth Cadbury was very ambivalent about it. She actually refused an invitation to chair the British Committee, and she thought that it would harm the course of peace at the time. And her stance, I think, hints at some of the complexities of the Quaker responses to war in this period. Not all Quakers were pacifist and opposed to the war. In fact, a third of young Quaker men of eligible military age did actually serve in the armed forces, including Elizabeth's son Bertie, who was a sort of fighter pilot in what later became the Royal Air Force. And the war caused tensions and divisions in some of these local Quaker families that were very difficult to overcome and took a long time. Now, before the Hague Congress was established, a local branch of the Women's International League, which is the group that was formed at the Hague Congress, had been established in Birmingham in 1915, and it had 117 members by October 1916, so that gives you some idea of the level of support for it. A number of women's peace meetings were held in the city throughout the war. So, for example, on Christmas Eve, 1916, a peace meeting was held in the Bullring, where a procession of women walk from a prayer meeting held at the Priory Rooms in Bull Street, where the Quaker Meeting House is located. They walk down to the Bullring, where they're addressed by Margaret Haley, and a similar peace meeting is held a week later on New Year's Eve. Similarly, on the 29th of July 1917, another peace meeting was held in the Bullring as part of the National Women's Peace Crusade, which was happening all over the country during that period of time. The local press, which you can see an extract from there, reported that a crowd of about 300 assembled in Old Square and again marched to the Bullring. The principal speaker was Helen Crawford of Glasgow, who was a very well-known peace campaigner nationally, and the meeting was organised by Margaret Haley on behalf of the local branch of the Women's International League. Now, Haley wasn't a Quaker, but she's obviously mixing in this sort of milieu, and she's interesting because she was a member of the Women's Social and Political Union. So again, her story indicates that things often aren't as simple or as straightforward as we think we are. So on the whole, the WSPU was supportive of the war, but we have a member, a former hunger striker on behalf of the WSPU, went on hunger strike in Holloway in 1912, and that's her WSPU medal that she was awarded for that act. So we have her organising peace committees. So again, the story is more complex and more nuanced than we're sometimes led to believe. Now, the women's peace activism was directly linked to their humanitarian relief activities with refugees and non-combatants. They perceived it all as part of their witness for peace, or peace testimony, as they would phrase it. They also see it as a constructive contribution to the cause of international friendship and international understanding. And their humanitarian activism takes a number of forms, and it depends on their personal circumstances, their particular interests, and their political perspectives. Again, their activities had begun before 1914. Local Quaker women, for example, are involved in fundraising for the Balkan Wars of 1912-13. And their activism extends way beyond 1918. So when we're talking about the activism of Quaker women in relation to the First World War, we have to extend the sort of time frame that we normally associate with the war into the sort of the mid-1920s and beyond. For these women, it was part of a plethora of humanitarian and peace activities in which they engaged during the first half of the 20th century, rather than an isolated event for the duration of the war. Now, as time is short, I'm not going to talk in detail about their activities, their humanitarian activities on the home front in Birmingham, other than to say that several of them were active with Belgian refugees in particular. Several of the leading activists of the Birmingham War Refugees Committee were Quaker women. It was chaired by Elizabeth Cadbury and Dr. Mary Sturge, who you see there, who's one of the early women doctors and GPs in the city, was also very active alongside her kinswoman Evelyn Sturge. So they coordinate employment and housing. They run a lost relative bureau. They found a Belgian school from 1916, which you can see an image of there. They also, Geraldine Cadbury ran a maternity home for Belgian women in Carpenter Road in Edgbaston, where well over 100 Belgian children are born during the war. And elements of that history are published. You know, if you're interested in that side of things, then there are published accounts that you can look at. They were similarly involved with the housing of Serbian refugee boys in Selly Oak from 1916. And again, you can see an image of the boys down there. And they also supported 18 girls from Vienna who come to live in Bourneville for a year from October 1920 as part of the Quaker relief activities in that city after the war. But my primary interest is in the women who undertake relief work abroad, so on home fronts elsewhere, if you like, in France, Russia, Germany, Austria and Poland. And during that sort of relief, they're responsible for feeding, for health provision and for creating homes for the displaced. And a number of my Birmingham group were involved in this sort of activity with the Friends War Victims Relief Committee, or the Warwicks as they're called by Quakers. And just to give you a bit of national context, I suppose, of the total of 473 Warwicks relief workers who were active in Europe between 1914 and 1918, 156 of those are women. And then there are a further 880 women involved in relief work abroad up to 1923. So we're talking about a lot of women undertaking humanitarian aid in different parts of war-torn Europe. Locally, one of the most active was Florence Barrow. And although at first glance, if you look down that potted biography of her there, she might seem extraordinary, she's one of several women who display a lifelong commitment to humanitarian aid and working in war-torn areas throughout their lives. Starting in the First World War and then going through the interwar period through things like the Russian famine, the Spanish Civil War, and then into the Second World War. So, born in 1876, Florence was the daughter of businessman and former Lord Mayor Richard Cadbury Barrow and his wife Jane Harrison. Soon after the outbreak of the First World War, she travels for Frioul, near Marseille, where she worked in a quarantine station for Serbian refugees. In July 1916, and that's an earlier photograph of her that you see there. In July 1916, she joins the Quaker team in Buzaluk in Russia, where she was involved in feeding programs, establishing nurseries for children and occupational workshops for adults. And she and fellow Birmingham Quaker Annie Wells are both in Russia throughout the revolution of 1917 and right home, describing it. One of the things that she talks about in late 1917, for example, is the fact that the women of Russia have been given the vote for the first time. But the women in the house that she's staying, they can't persuade any of them to go to vote because they don't know anything about the candidates. So she writes, where is it? Think how one felt to be here the first time the women of the country had a vote and no one knew enough to vote. And she's sort of, disappointed and contrasting that with her own situation, obviously as a British woman who didn't have the vote. Like many of the Quaker women relief workers, Florence stressed the personal aspects of the relief, the importance of developing a personal relationship with the recipients of that relief, and an insight into her practice as well as some of her motivation can be gleaned from this extract from her memories of working in Russia. And she writes, before deciding exactly what form our relief work should take, many hundreds of families of refugees were visited. I do not know that I ever have had a sadder and more depressing piece of work. To go into house after house and find old men, women, girls, children, sitting inert, unoccupied and hopeless, unwelcome guests in an already overcrowded home. One after another would tell of the good house they had left in the West, surrounded by a pleasant, fruitful garden. Nevertheless, we are convinced that the sufferings these people have undergone and are undergoing has a special claim upon us whose homes have not been destroyed by war or who have not been transported as unwelcome guests into districts thousands of miles away, there to drag out year after year a dreary and miserable existence. So in January 1920, she moves to Poland, where the Quaker team were battling typhus, disinfecting both people themselves and their houses. And one of the concerns in which she's most involved was the lack of housing and the poor conditions in which the refugees live. As you can see from these images, many of them were living in old army dugouts. And so the Quaker team are very involved in building houses, basically, to try and improve the housing situation. She also undertook agricultural relief, supplying over 1,000 horses and coordinating the ploughing of some 24,000 acres, distributing tools and seeds, which is what she's doing here in this image. And again, this is activity that reflects the Quakers' belief in providing sustainable long-term relief as well as emergency aid. They very much believed in doctrines of self-help, giving people the tools to help themselves, thinking that that will improve people's self-respect in the long term, and so on. And Florence is one of several women who found opportunities to exercise authority and leadership through relief work. From June 1921, she was appointed to lead the Quaker team in Poland. So that's the British Quaker team and the American Quaker team who are active there. She replaces the original leader, the American William Fogg, whose management style, shall we say, had caused some dissension among the workers. She was in Poland until 1924, and again she's working on housing and on establishing an orphanage and a vocational training school. And her experience of housing refugees in Poland reinvigorates her interest in housing issues at home. When she returns to Birmingham in 1924, she's one of the founders of the Kopek Housing Improvement Society. And she spends the next few decades taking a very practical interest in improving working class housing in the city. Now, Florence wasn't the only one for whom the work continued after 1918. Birmingham women like Constance Smith of Bourneville and the Birmingham teacher Francesca Wilson were working in Austria and in Russia during this period as well. And the activism continues at home. Local Quakers were involved in campaigning against the Allied blockade and the effect that that had on women and children in Germany, Austria and Russia. So they hold public meetings, they publish protests, they send letters to local MPs and to central government. And you can see that some of these women are politicised by the war. So Florence, for example, joins the Independent Labour Party with her brother Harrison at the end of the war. And that's to do, I think, with the support of the ILP for peace campaigns and so on. Several of them visit Europe on fact-finding tours in the immediate post-war period, and they also attend international women's gatherings. So here we have a photo of the British delegation to the Women's International Peace Congress at Zurich, which was held between the 12th and the 17th of May 1919. And I have to make sure I don't, and that is Theodora Mary Wilson, a Birmingham Quaker, who's part of that British delegation alongside the leaders of the British women's peace movement. So in that photo, I mean, I can't identify them all, are people like Kathleen Courtney, Charlotte Despard, Isabella Ford, Emmeline Pethick Lawrence, Crystal Macmillan, Catherine Marshall and Ellen Wilkinson. Theodora and her husband Henry Lloyd Wilson are leading lights of the Independent Labour Party locally, and he's very active with conscientious objectors during the war. And here she is again, this time in her election leaflet from 1923, when she's elected as Labour councillor for Selly Oak, a position she occupies until 1932. And in her election leaflet, she campaigns on the basis that every ward in the city should have at least one woman councillor. They all had 3 councillors. And, you know, she believed that at least one of those should be a woman. She also campaigns on the basis of housing and employment, education, and maternity and infant welfare provision. Theodora chairs the Birmingham branch of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and she's also chair of the Birmingham branch of the Women's Peace Crusade. So, in the interwar period, peace increasingly becomes seen as a woman's issue. The local branch of the Women's International League, and again, to give you an idea, by October 1919, the local WILF have a membership of about 250. So, you know, they're a significant group of people. They continue their campaigns for peace through the interwar period, working with other women's organisations in the city, like the Women's Cooperative Guild. And this, for example, is a photo of the disarmament shop that they had in Bull Street in May 1931 as part of a will disarmament campaign that was going on at that time. Individually, some of my women, like Florence, returned to relief work in the 1930s. They become increasingly concerned as the growth of fascism, and so they're involved in humanitarian relief in the Spanish Civil War and with Jewish and other refugees from Nazi Germany and Austria. And I'll just close, I suppose, by saying that remarkably little research has been done on these women and on their peace campaigns and humanitarian aid during the First World War and generally, in fact. It's a very under-researched area of women's history. I think it's an important area for all their complexities. They're fascinating women, some of them are inspiring, and their life stories hold a number of resonances with our current situation today, particularly if we're looking at the international situation and you know, displaced people generally. And lastly, I suppose, I think it's very important that during this centenary we also remember people who objected to the war and actually mark the contributions of those people who worked constructively for a better, more peaceful, more equal world. Okay, thank you.